Have you ever walked away from an argument thinking, I proved my point, yet somehow the other person seemed even more convinced they were right? Have you ever noticed that the harder you try to persuade someone, the more resistant they become? What if I told you that arguing is one of the least effective ways to change someone's mind? And what if real influence has nothing to do with winning and everything to do with understanding? Most of us, when we want to convince someone, instinctively turn to logic. We present facts, we bring evidence, we explain, we repeat ourselves. Sometimes we even raise our voices without realizing it. And at the end, we feel certain that we were right. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Arguing rarely changes minds. In many cases, it strengthens resistance. Psychology has a term for this. It is called psychological reactance. When people feel that their freedom of choice is being threatened, their brain automatically moves into defense mode. Even if your argument is logical, even if your intention is good, the moment pressure is felt, resistance begins. Think about the last time someone told you, you have to do this. What was your first reaction? Agreement or resistance? The human brain values autonomy. It protects freedom. When that sense of freedom is challenged, stubbornness appears. This is why logical arguments, especially when mixed with emotional intensity, often produce the opposite result. Instead of opening minds, they close them. Another psychological pattern strengthens this effect: confirmation bias. We naturally search for information that supports what we already believe, and we ignore what challenges us. So when you attack someone's belief directly, their brain does not calmly evaluate your logic. It filters your words, it looks for flaws, it prepares counter-arguments. In simple terms, when you argue, the other person listens less and defends more. So the question becomes, how do you influence without triggering defense? Real influence begins at the moment the other person doesn't feel like they're losing. Persuasion is not about pushing harder. It's not about overwhelming someone with superior reasoning. It's more like unlocking a door than forcing it open. You need to sense when to speak, when to pause, and when to simply listen. Influence is not about breaking resistance. It's about redirecting thought. And that process starts with something surprisingly simple: making the other person feel heard. Before someone accepts your perspective, they need to experience understanding. There's a golden principle in communication. People do not only want to be right, they want to be understood. When someone feels genuinely understood, their defensive walls begin to lower. Not because they suddenly agree, but because their brain receives a signal of safety. Safety reduces resistance. Safety opens curiosity. This is where active listening becomes powerful. Active listening is not passive silence. It's reflection. It's emotional acknowledgement. It's showing the other person that you truly grasp what they are saying. Instead of saying, "That's wrong," try saying, "I understand why you see it that way. Given your experience, that makes sense." That shift changes the emotional climate of the conversation. The person no longer feels attacked, they feel recognized. Another subtle technique is verbal mirroring. This means reflecting part of what the other person says in a natural and sincere way. If someone says, "I'm afraid of making this decision because I've failed before," you might respond, "So your hesitation is more about your past experiences than this specific situation." When people hear their thoughts accurately reflected, they relax. They feel understood rather than judged. Listening does not mean agreeing. You can disagree completely while still validating emotion. The goal is not surrender. The goal is psychological safety. Without safety, persuasion rarely succeeds. Many people fear empathy makes them look weak. Research consistently shows the opposite. Empathy builds trust, and trust is the foundation of influence. When someone feels heard, they become more willing to hear you. Before that moment, your words are simply bouncing off a wall. There's also a powerful form of influence that feels almost invisible. It happens when the other person believes the idea was their own. Psychology refers to this as psychological ownership. When people feel ownership over an idea, they defend it more strongly than if it were imposed from the outside. This is why direct commands often fail, but thoughtful questions can transform conversations. Instead of saying, "This is the best choice," ask, "What do you think might happen if you chose this path?" Now their mind begins to analyze. The reasoning comes from within. And when insight is self-generated, resistance decreases. This principle has roots in the Socratic method, guiding thought through questions rather than delivering conclusions. People rarely change because someone hands them an answer. They change because they arrive at it themselves. But questions must feel curious, not confrontational. There's a profound difference between asking, "Don't you think you're wrong?" and asking, "What led you to that conclusion?" One challenges identity, the other invites reflection. Another technique is planting seeds. Instead of presenting a complete argument, you introduce a small observation and allow silence to work. You might say, "It's interesting how some people took a different approach and achieved unexpected results," and then you pause. Silence creates cognitive tension. The brain wants to fill gaps. In that space, your idea begins to grow inside their thinking without pressure. However, influence is not purely intellectual. Emotions drive decisions far more than logic. We prefer to believe that we are rational beings who carefully analyze facts, but neuroscience suggests that emotions initiate decisions, and logic often arrives later to justify them. Even in major life choices like careers, investments, or relationships, emotions like fear, hope, pride, security, and belonging shape outcomes. If you want to persuade effectively, you must identify which emotion is active beneath the surface. This is known as recognizing the emotional trigger. For one person, it may be fear of failure. For another, the need for recognition. For someone else, the desire for control or stability. Influence begins with identifying that emotional driver and aligning your message with it. But exaggeration is dangerous. Emotional influence should feel natural, not manipulative. Instead of saying, "If you don't do this, everything will fall apart," ask, "What do you think the worst-case scenario would be if you tried this?" Now the emotion activates internally without you becoming the source of fear. Instead of declaring, "This decision proves you're strong," ask, "What kind of image does this choice reflect about you?" Now identity enters the conversation. Emotional alignment is not manipulation, it's understanding what already matters to the other person. At this point, we must address ethics. Influence without ethics becomes manipulation. Manipulation may create short-term compliance, but it destroys long-term trust. The difference lies in transparency. Influence respects freedom of choice. Manipulation hides intention. There is a concept called cognitive trust. It's the belief that even if we disagree, the other person does not intend harm. Once that trust disappears, even truthful words lose their power. A simple internal test can guide you. Ask yourself, if I were in their position, would I feel comfortable if someone used this method on me? If the answer is no, you have crossed the line. It is also important to accept that influence doesn't always work. Some people aren't ready to change. Some beliefs are tied deeply to identity. Applying more pressure in those moments often triggers what psychologists call the backfire effect. The harder you push, the firmer the person clings to their original belief. Sometimes the most powerful move is stepping back, not because you failed, but because timing matters. True influence is not about constant persuasion. It's about awareness, knowing when to speak, knowing when to listen, and knowing when silence carries more power than words. In the end, persuading without arguing is less about technique and more about mindset. It requires seeing people not as opponents to defeat, but as minds to understand. When that perspective shifts, influence stops being force. It becomes flow,
a natural exchange instead of a battle. And perhaps the deepest realization is this: much of what we call reality is shaped inside the human mind. When you understand how the mind protects itself, how it values choice, how it responds to safety, and how it changes, you no longer need to fight to be right. You simply learn how to guide without resistance.